Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Melissa George from the Consortium for Service Innovation. My official title is Program Director, but that doesn't really mean anything. And I have with me on the phone from the Consortium as well, Greg Oxton and Kelly Murray, who are just the two that were speaking, if you're not familiar with their voices. So we're going to spend probably the next 45 minutes, hopefully just going over the high level of what the KCS V6 is, and then link you up with some resources if you want to get more detailed information around that. So roughly the agenda is we're going to go over a little bit about the journey of how we got to where we are today, what the principles and core concepts are, and then get into just a little bit of detail around the practices, talk about a timeline for next steps, and then talk about our upcoming events, and also go over what it means for people who have hold certifications from the KCS Academy and what that might look like as far as updating your certifications. So a little bit about the journey.
Can I pause you just for 1 second, Melissa?
Yeah.
Because we have so many folks on the phone, if you have questions, we'd love to put them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So just that's in your GoToMeeting control panel. Put your questions there. Thank you.
Okay, good. So can everybody hear me all right before I get started? And sound good?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, good. Thank you. So a little bit about the journey. So KCS is, like we say, is always a journey, and believe it or not, we started back in March of 2013, and this is a photo of us at the Black Ridge Vineyard Tasting Room, where David Kay hosted us to a meeting about, the title of the meeting were Challenges Being Faced with KCS. And what we identified with some of those challenges is that because that KCS was very service-oriented, and where we started with talking about KCS was very focused on the CRM system and an incident management or case tracking system. And what KCS had become was a very transaction-focused methodology as opposed to the holistic methodology I think that we had originally intended it to be. So it got very tactical. In the Practices Guide, 156 pages was kind of the, you see a lot of that very transactional, tactical stuff. And so what was happening is that people were losing focus from between KCS and the vision of the organization. And when things like senior executive turnover happened, which was a lot in the services industry, the executives didn't really know what was the value of KCS. It was really perceived to be very tactical and too small, and really only for services. So what we set out to do was like, well, how can we change this perception? Because we knew that the methodology was much deeper than this transactional, very service-focused. So over the course of the last almost 3 years, there's been 40 companies involved in talking about this change, which comprised of 13 conference calls, 8 face-to-face team meetings, many emails, KCS V6 office hours between Greg and Kelly and I'm trying to get all the updates made to the Practices Guide, hours of editing, and then also the processing of feedback and comments that have been put in on the library and our MindTouch pages from people like Russ Brooks and Jacob Watts that were interacting with the Practices Guide and giving us feedback around that. And so then one of the pivotal moments was when we met at Avaya and talked about really changing the coaching model and evolving, and how can we continue to evolve KCS. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But at that meeting at the winery, Brad Smith, who always has very, Mr. Analogy is what we call him, so as an analogy for everything, said, if we take incidents out of the Jenga stack, would KCS fall apart? Was his big question. And unanimously, the people in the meeting said, no, we just need a new way to think about KCS. So at the Avaya meeting, this is at Avaya, hosted by Russ Brooks is as part of this, and Dan Pratt and Mike Renda were all at this meeting. And when Mike Renda took over at Avaya, the big thing was everyone within the support organization was going to be able to be publishers, and really transformed the customer experience from not being very based on transactions and levels of publishing and certifications to a much more knowledge-focused, and really the work was not really just support analysts. The work were really knowledge workers, and they really had to become knowledge workers and have a bigger vision of how their jobs were going to change. So that was like one step in this process of change. And then what the next the next discussion we had as part of the team that was updating KCS was really about how can we change the structure of how we document KCS in order to start to communicate the connection between KCS and the organizational level, the goals of the organization. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Greg to talk about how we kind of had to change our internal structure of the way we thought about KCS and pull out what parts of that the KCS was really the foundational levels versus which were the transaction practices type levels. So Greg, I'm going to hand it back to you, I think.
I did. I took it.
Oh, you took it. That's why my control panel went away.
I made myself the presenter.
Okay, thank you for taking that initiative.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. So one of the changes is, which Melissa was talking about, is shifting the focus from this very support transaction-centric world to more of a service, a broader perspective for KCS. And so we're changing the name, although the acronym stays the same, still call it KCS, but it's Knowledge-Centered Service to try and give it a broader perspective in terms of any customer-supplier kind of relationship or service relationship may or may not have a case or an incident associated with it. And one of the things, the journey often goes in cycles. Well, now my slides won't advance. One of the things that we realized through the conversation over time is that we've never really related the principles and core concepts as clearly as we might. And the cycle that I'm referring to is back in the late 90s. We actually only talked about KCS from a principle and concept point of view, but found that organizations really struggled to translate principles and concepts into techniques and practices. So there's a fair amount of work in the late 90s, early 2000 to describe KCS in a fairly prescriptive way. And that's when John Schmay and Livia Wilson wrote the very first practices guide. But now what we find is people take it too literally. The practices guide is a collection of our experience and how our members have adopted KCS or implemented it. It is not the only way to do it. There are lots of ways to do it. But there are certain principles that you don't want to violate, or if you violate certain principles, then you're really not doing KCS. So we spent quite a bit of time with a small team of folks talking about what are those core principles and concepts, and have created a new document, which is in the library, called KCS Principles and Core Concepts. And that those really form the kernel for KCS, and that we want to control that with a pretty small group of folks. So very much like Linux works in the open source software world, there's a kernel that very few people can change, and then there's a bigger audience that can write all kinds of applications and things that sit on top of that kernel. And so for KCS, the kernel is the principles and core concepts, and the practices and the techniques, how you actually go about doing it at the task level or describing it in terms of work and activities. It's very open. So we're hoping that lots of people will contribute to the techniques so long as they adhere to the principles and core concepts. So then we had to define what do we mean by a principle. And this definitions and vocabulary are important. This was a bit of a struggle at first in terms of distinguishing principles from practices from techniques. So where we landed is a principle is a belief or core concept. And they will apply to multiple practices. There's not a one-to-one relationship between the principles and the practices. The practices is how we organize what we need to do, and unanimously, everyone that was involved in this work agreed that the solve loop and evolve loop model is a great way to organize the things we need to do. It's based on double loop learning and autonomic systems, and the power of double loop systems is that they are self-correcting. Continuous improvement is inherent in the design of the processes. And so we've kept the solve and evolve loop and the 8 practices as a way to organize the techniques. So at the very core is the beliefs and the core concepts, and then there's how we organize things in this double loop concept, and then the techniques that further define what it is we actually need to do, the actions required. So for the principles and core concepts, we've embraced the Creative Commons licenses. We've always had a right to use with attribution license agreement on the KCS Practices Guide. But because we want to control the principles and core concepts, those are not things that just anybody can change. That's the kernel. And so the consortium will control those quite closely with a small group of people. And we've put a right to use with attribution, non-commercial, no derivative works allowed, which means people can't take it apart, redefine it, or build extensions to it. They are what they are, based on the folks based on the members that work on the principles and core concepts. For the practices guide and the techniques, we're using a right to use with attribution, non-commercial derivative works allowed, which means we hope that lots of people will contribute to this and share the techniques they're using in legal or in accounting or in product management in terms of how they've embraced KCS, or in different industries, healthcare or financial services. Now, both of these say non-commercial use, which means you can't build a business around it or sell things that are based on these principles, core concepts, or the practices. But we do offer a number of ways, a number of mechanisms whereby people can get a license to use for commercial purposes. So we have our certified trainers, and that essentially establishes a license agreement with the certified trainers to use the materials in commercial endeavors, meaning they can charge revenue for workshops and things. And we have the KCS Verified program, which is for products that support KCS, and obviously those are almost always for sale. Some of them are open, like the wiki, but most of them are commercial endeavors. And then we have the KCS Aligned, which is a much more lightweight designation for things that help support the success of KCS. It's not a platform on which you could do KCS, but they're complementary to the platforms which are part of the KCS Aligned program. So the numerous ways we are enabling commercial use of this material, and almost all of them include royalty payments, which help support the consortium's work. So new licenses. The principles, and after considerable iterations on this, we came up with 4. That there are 4 deep principles. One is abundance. It says the more we share, the more we learn. Knowledge operates on a principle of abundance. In that, and one of our favorite quotes, which is on the website, is if you have an apple and I have an apple and we share apples, we cut them in half and share apples, then we still each have 1 apple. But if I have an idea and you have an idea and we share ideas, when we leave, we each have 2 ideas. And so that's the idea of abundance that says, the more we share, the more we learn. It's not a bounded, knowledge is not a bounded entity. It is unbounded. And that's very different. That principle of abundance really is pretty important to understand in terms of when a principle of abundance is applicable versus when a principle of scarcity is applicable, because most of our business models that have evolved over the last 100 years are based on the principle of scarcity, which is one reason organizations, I think, struggle with the adoption of KCS, is because it really introduces another pretty deep principle that needs to be embraced in terms of this idea of abundance. The second one is demand-driven. Knowledge is almost always the byproduct of an interaction. It's interaction with other people. It's an interaction with a web page, with a book, in a workshop. And so demand-driven is one of the deep principles, and this is in part what drives the efficiency of the whole system. We do things based on experience, and we do things based on interaction. We don't do things, we don't make up things to do in the absence of demand. And you can see this evident in almost all of the KCS practices. Create value. So the third one, create value, says people should be working tasks, meaning in a support environment, handling incidents or cases, in the context of the big picture. If people only focus on solving the issue, resolving the case or the incident, and they don't understand the bigger picture, the evolve loop, then they won't do it with the level of quality and with an understanding of the long-term implication that task might have over time. And so this really reinforces the double loop thinking. It ties back to that. If people do their work in the solve loop with an understanding of the evolve loop, they're more likely to do it in a way that really helps create value. And the last one, although not last, but maybe most fundamental, is trust. KCS really requires that people exercise judgment. If you are in an environment where everything is scripted, then KCS is probably not a good fit. Judgment is required is a theme that reoccurs throughout the entire collection of practices. And it's based, trust shows up in a number of different ways. It's based on the fact that we trust people given they have the right information and the right perspective. They understand what our purpose is and what our brand promise is, that they will make good judgments in their interactions with our customers or users. That we trust the system, that we trust the process, that the system is making the right information and knowledge available to the right people at the right time. So in the absence of trust, if we design systems from the point of view of a lack of trust and make them very controlling, it really removes people's ability to make judgments. And you can't do KCS in an environment where people are not allowed to make judgments. When you give people access to the collective experience of the organization, a broad collection of knowledge, they have to make good judgments in the use of that knowledge. So trust is one of the 4 principles. So abundance, demand-driven, create value, and trust are the 4 core principles. Now we hope that those 4 will act as an acid test. So if you're having a conversation with a team of people about adopting KCS, and should we do this or should we do that? For example, should we require that articles be validated by customers, or do we trust people to make a judgment? Do we trust the support engineers to make the judgment as to whether or not they're confident in the resolution and act accordingly? So these 4 principles, we hope, will be sort of a touchstone or an acid test that you can evaluate options in how you're pursuing your workflow, how you're designing your content standard, how you're designing your measurement system, and that, is it coming from a point of view of abundance? Is it demand-driven? Is it creating value? And are we operating on a basis of trust? So there are lots of ways, as I mentioned earlier, to do KCS, but you can't violate these 4 principles. that's what we're trying to get at with these 4 things. Then a little more detail on some KCS core concepts. Sorry about it. So transformation and continuous improvement. And this really, again, talks about the double loop. Organizing the practices in the double loop. The solve loop is the reactive piece, and the evolve loop is the reflective piece, reflecting on a collection of events or activities that were done in the solve loop. For most organizations, that represents a pretty big transformation in how they think about process. Buy-in at all levels. So great things happen when people do the KCS practices or do the solve loop because they believe in it and they understand it, and because they care about the purpose and the vision and mission of the organization. If you have to coerce people into using the knowledge base, the likelihood they will use it appropriately or use it well or create value is very low. The ideal case is when leadership has done their job and created a compelling purpose, a demand, a brand promise and a vision that people are excited about, that people care about, and that they choose to help. And when people choose to help, great things happen. So buy-in at all levels. And mentioning a vision, leadership is required. So the communication, the creation of the vision, which we define a vision as being a compelling purpose, a mission statement, and a brand promise. Those 3 things make up the vision, and the leadership is responsible to create that, but more importantly, to communicate that and do it in a way that really engages people, such that they care about the people they work with and the organization they work for. And what we're trying to do is create a knowledge base of our collective experience. It's very difficult to predict the future value of an interaction, and so we want to capture that efficiently as we can, and then let demand drive our attention to those articles or those interactions that really have value over time. If the question is worth answering, if the problem is worth solving, it's worth having in the knowledge base. And then we let the demand drive our attention to that content that has the most value. Collective ownership. So the degree to which people feel that this is our knowledge base, it's the best we know to date. And in the moment of use, as I'm interacting with articles, as a user of the knowledge base, I am an owner of the knowledge base, and I'm responsible to flag or fix to improve articles as I interact with them. If I'm confident and licensed, I fix it. If I'm not confident or not licensed, but I think there's something that could be improved about an article, or there's something confusing about an article, then I flag it. And that goes to a subject matter expert who can take corrective action. If you can build a culture where people feel like the knowledge base is theirs, it doesn't belong to somebody else, it belongs to the people who use it every day, and they actually embrace the concept of flag it or fix it, then the content you're interacting with is constantly improving and being kept fresh and current. Seek to understand before we seek to solve. So this is not unique to KCS. It's part of the 7 Habits of Successful People by Covey. It's part of the Kempner-Trago problem-solving process. It shows up in lots of places. And this is the search early, search often. Seek to understand what we collectively know about this issue before you start to solve it, to avoid rework. But also seek to understand what the customer's experience was before you start solving it. So search early, search often, seek to understand before you seek to solve is just a good problem-solving practice. And then sufficient to solve, so when we're talking about the content we're creating or improving or reusing through the process of interactions, it only needs to be sufficient to solve. It needs to be good enough to be findable and usable by a specific audience. It doesn't have to be perfect or pristine. And this is, again, part of the efficiency system. The quality criteria for service and support content is different than it is for more formal documents like spec sheets or pricing sheets or some of your product information. Sufficient to solve. Knowledge integration. So we want to integrate use of the knowledge base into the problem-solving process or into the workflow. And so in environments that are not doing KCS, we often hear people talk about using the knowledge base as a last resort. If they don't know the answer or they can't find it from their peers or in their own personal notes, then they might look in the knowledge base or some repository. And really what we want to have happen is to have the knowledge base be the first resource. We want people to integrate use of the knowledge base as the first place they look. And if people are doing that, then they will be more likely to recognize what they're working on is already known and solved, and more likely to identify opportunities to improve content that already exists. And if it doesn't exist, they are responsible to create it. So use of the knowledge base as an integral part of a person's workflow is what drives a lot of the benefits. Coaching for success. So the behaviors that drive those benefits, integrating knowledge into the work, use of the knowledge base into the workflow, understanding sufficient to solve, search early, search often, a lot of these things we've just talked about, really requires coaching because it is a behavior change for most knowledge workers. And one of the things we're updating in version 6 is strengthening the coach section. In particular, we used to talk about the fact that coaching, the need for coaching diminishes over time as people get licensed and learn to do this. And what we're finding is that, in fact, it doesn't. Coaching really, there's a need for coaching on an ongoing basis, maybe not as intense as during the learning curve. But additionally, there's a need for coaching for managers. And this is evolving the role of the first and second line managers is a big part of version 6, and their responsibility and the fact that it is a big change for them, and coaching is really applicable to the managers as well as the support agents. Assess value, and this one is the idea of measuring what teams and individuals are creating value, not who's busy or active. We frequently say, do not put goals on activities. Goals on activities will corrupt your knowledge base, guaranteed. If you put goals on creation, on reuse, on modify, on any of the activities, it doesn't drive the behaviors or the outcomes that you want. We want to know, we want people to create value in the knowledge base, not just be busy. And this takes us into the whole triangulation concept and using radar charts and things like that to present value footprints. So those are the 10 core concepts. And then the next level of the model is the practices, which are the solve loop and evolve loop, which have not changed since V5. So those are documented. The principles and core concepts are documented in a document that's in the library. We'd love to get some feedback on that. The initial feedback has been positive. We tried to make it not too big of a document so it's readable. The other thing we've worked a lot on is vocabulary. So Melissa mentioned that taking KCS out of the support environment where we're working cases and incidents and really into the knowledge worker environment. And so talking about the people who do this work, we no longer talk about support analysts, we talk about knowledge workers. Not sure what just happened there. We don't talk so much about the customer, we talk about requester or user. We don't talk so much about the business, we talk about the organization. It could be an educational organization, a university, it could be a hospital, it could be a for-profit business. So not everybody relates to the identity of a business, so we talk more about organizations than the business. The problem-solving process, we talk about a requester-responder workflow. And so KCS really, again, focuses on capturing, on reusing, improving, or if it doesn't exist, creating content at that point of interaction, which is that requester-responder workflow. And then introducing the concept of experience-based knowledge versus compliance-based knowledge. Because as we move into legal environments or healthcare or financial services or lots of industries that have compliance requirements, legal requirements, or policies that are not subject to debate or being changed by masses of people. They're controlled by a very small group of people. So acknowledging that there's really at least two types of articles. There are those that are more organic and general experience-based, and there are those that are compliance-based that have restrictions on who can create or modify those. And then the phrase that so I think, Melissa, maybe you took presenting back?
I did.
Well, then I can't.
I did.
So advance the slide there. Okay.
I did. I'm with you.
Okay. So we used to focus a lot on this idea of create in the workflow, and in most instances, once you get started with KCS, you're doing way more reuse than you are creating, and so kind of changing that whole mentality to focus less on create. Create's important, but only if it doesn't exist. So using the phrase, in the workflow, we want to search, reuse, link, improve, and if it doesn't exist, create. As kind of the soundbite for how the workflow, how to think about the workflow. And so, did you take it back because you do the next slide, Melissa?
I do. I got a little ahead of you.
Okay. So now, Melissa's going to talk a little bit more about some of the details in the practices and techniques.
Okay, so if you didn't see in the chat, Kelly has put the link to the library. So the KCS V6 Practices Guide, as well as the principles and core concepts, can be found there. And I'm going to go into a little detail, kind of at a high level, on what the changes are. But if you really want to get into the detail, I recommend you go into the library and read the chapters on the particular changes. And also a very helpful part of it is the appendix that contains the changes. So we've tried to document as many as details around the exact changes that were made. And again, this is a journey, so this is really just the start of building the foundation so that we can continue to expand our thinking beyond services. So our hope is that we'll eventually have some specific techniques around non-services related functions within the organization. So as we, like Salesforce is using KCS in human resources. So if we could have techniques that are specific to what you would do in human resources, we're going to continue to grow the library of techniques around different functions within the organization. Well, an important part that as the team was working that they decided was that the 8 practices has served us very well. So the 8 practices as we know them today are still intact. Double loop process has served us very well. So that all still stays the same. And summary of the changes are really a lot with around the vocabulary to start including different job functions and all types of interactions, not just calls, but to also handle emails, chat sessions, any channels that you're using for an interaction. So we start to use the term interaction in the replacement of where we may have called it a case or an incident. So I'm changing the vocabulary to interactions instead of just case-driven. And then also we realized that the article states that we were currently using were not, there wasn't a definition that was clearly understood by everyone, and so we've broken that up a little bit, and I'm going to go into detail around that one. And then also the evolve loop, and realizing that we needed to really spend more time on reinforcing why the evolve loop practices were important and how they feed the solve loop. The solve loop we had it very well defined, but I think making sure that people understood the connections between what they did in the solve loop and how that it affected the evolve loop, or how the evolve loop practice affected the solve loop. So we've done a lot of work around really enhancing the evolve loop side. And then also feeding into that is how do we measure the effectiveness of the Evolve Loop? And I'm going to go into a little bit more around how we have some indicators around the health of the Evolve Loop. And then we've added a whole section around self-service success, and from what we've learned from organizations on how they're measuring the success of self-service, because you usually don't have a countable interaction or system of record around that. So how do you measure that when you go to web self-service, it's you're being successful there. And then also around, supporting this whole leadership is required core concept, and the trust and the trust principle is how to make sure that leadership is really communicating and people understand why they're doing the job as opposed to just doing the job. So it's strengthening the leadership and communication section to support that. So the article state, we'll start there. So what we've done is divide up what was, before article state was really a reflection of the article quality or confidence and the article visibility. So if something was in a published state, it was saying that we were confident and it was visible outside of the organization. And so what we've done is split that into, into 3 metadata fields that, so that you have more flexibility in separating the quality of the article from the visibility of the article. We've seen organizations who might have low confidence in an article, but want that visible outside their organization, because that is a way to gain confidence in it by getting people to use it. So if you, as long as you indicate your confidence level, the visibility can span from being very closed to a very small group of people, or you could put it out to a whole user community if you wanted to. So pulling those apart. And then also around article governance. So this really supports the concept of having a small kernel or a controlled group. So if you have compliance type articles that people, there's certain parts of that compliance that cannot be edited by anyone that are a very small group of people. So and then another part of that article could open up to a wider community. So separating out that governance so that you can really support compliance rules and also have that collective ownership work as well. So that's where that article governance comes in. So as far as article quality or confidence that you have in the article, these are the proposed states. So simplifying it so that the work in progress is the article that you're not complete, you have very low confidence in it. The not validated article is one that it is complete as far as you know. You have a resolution, but the confidence in that resolution, maybe you weren't quite sure. It only worked once. You weren't quite sure in the resolution, so you mark it as not validated. And as it gets reused, it can then move to a validated state. Or if you don't have the permissions to mark it as a validated state. So, for example, if you're just a candidate, you could then optionally flag that to go to a coach for review at that point. So you could be confident but not have the permissions. And then the last state is archived. So in addition to that, in order to know kind of the overall state of the article, you would want to know who has visibility to that article. So this just represents the different layers of visibility. So you could have it just internal to an organization, and then you could even segment it further to only have a particular knowledge domain visible to a particular knowledge domain. And I think someone on the chat asked a question about this earlier. So we talked about trust, and then the question was, well, should we trust people who don't have any knowledge about that particular product area to be able to, let's say, edit articles within another product domain? And so this would give you the ability to, by segmenting by domain, if it really were not at all relevant to a certain group of people, you might not want them to have visibility to certain articles. And then we've segmented it by partners are typically an extension of your internal organization, and then it goes out to your customers, and then the furthest level is public, which is where you don't have any kind of information about the person at all, so they don't sign in or haven't identified themselves. And then around article governance, so this is where the controlled would be where you were looking at compliance type articles, and that would be a very controlled small group of people. And then on the outer layer is what we call experience-based articles, which would be where your collective experience comes in. Another major change that was made was really looking at the health of the evolve loop. So what we've added are some indicators around the evolve loop practices, and we've tried to name them as closely as possible to the evolve loop that we can. So for example, around content health, we've called them content health indicators. And that's the AQI as we know it today, but we've also added not only article quality, but article relevance was something that, so people were linking articles, but they weren't relevant to the article. So really around content health, we're adding indicators, and what are we trying to create? Oops, what did I do? Went the wrong way. Sorry. And then around the process, so how are people adhering to the solve loop process, and how are we going to create it? And then around performance assessment, we really want to look at, from both an individual and team, like who is creating value. So really making sure that the performance assessment is looking at the value that people are creating. And then the whole set of really how are we measuring leadership and communication. So for example, we've never put any kind of measurement around communication, and we learned this through one organization that put out a communication survey, just asking people questions like, what is KCS? And what is the goals of KCS? And what is the initiatives of the program? And when will the program be rolled out? And who's involved in the program? And just things that we were assuming were getting communicated throughout the organization, particularly around the what's in it for me, and then asking people what's in it for them, and really assessing, is the communication working, or are people getting the right message, and just really putting some indicators around that, so that you know that you're getting the message out around what's the value, what's the purpose of the program, and then people understanding that. And then beefing up, so the leadership and communication section again is, adding to, are you creating a vision? Do people know what that vision is? Is it a compelling purpose? Is it adhering to the company's brand promise? We've been doing a lot of work around evolving the role of the line manager, or what we're calling the frozen middle, and we've been finding that probably one of the most common points of failure of a KCS implementation is the line managers not really understanding or knowing how to drive the behaviors to get the value out of, to get value creation, and have been so focused on measurements and behaviors around traditional support metrics like time to solve, and queue times, and hold times, and number of calls taken. So we're continuing to work on the role of the line manager, and how to get them to be able to drive the types of behaviors you want with KCS. So more to do. As I said, we're continuing to evolve the middle manager's role, and how do they lead knowledge workers. And then the other part of this is really, how do we get the materials all up to date, and the certification exams. So as you know, the KCS Academy has certifications for KCS Practices, KCS Publisher. So we'll continue to update the workshop materials over the next couple of months, and then the measurement matter paper. And then in June, we'll start to build the certification exam updates, and we'll run a beta test of those updates, update the study guides, and then we'll create a bridge exam. Early September will be the release of the bridge exam, and then we'll release the full V6 certifications after that. And then in April of next year, we'll get the KCS Verify Inline criteria and certifications done. Those are for the vendors who support the KCS practices. So we'll get that done in April of 2017. So some details around the updates to the certifications. This line to advance. I'm stuck. There we go. So for those holding the KCS Practices Certification or Publishers Exam from the KCS Academy, which, by the way, the KCS Academy is really the only certification program that is recognized by the consortium. If you hold one of those certifications, there'll be a bridge exam that you can take online, and it will be $85. And it will really just be questions that are about the differences between KCS V5 to V6. And I'd say the majority of those are going to be focused around the new metrics, and also making sure that understanding of the core principles and core concepts in V6. And then we'll have some questions around the new article states. And so those, I'd say, would probably be the major parts of that, but we haven't had those all clearly defined yet. And then who have just since April 17th, since we released V6, have taken the V5 certification, that bridge exam will be free to those people. And it will be, everyone will have like 1 year to do the bridge exam. If you don't do it within that year, then you'll have to go and do the full exam again. So I also wanted just to quickly cover upcoming events, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. So upcoming, can you see my screen there? Yeah, I think.
Yep, we can see it. If you could make it a little bigger.
There we go. So here we are today introducing KCS V6, and then our next team meeting is Wednesday of this week in San Francisco. And the consortium has 5 major initiatives other than KCS. So one of the other initiatives is around social communities and knowledge, and how social and communities fit in the big picture. And that meeting will be on Wednesday of this week. And then Greg's doing some workshops in Europe. Greg, why don't you talk a little bit about those? I think you probably know more about what's going on and where they are in detail.
So we've started, last year we started doing team meetings in Europe to support our European-based member companies. And so this year, or this spring in June, we'll be in Copenhagen doing a 2-day team meeting hosted by NNIT. And that will really focus on KCS version 6 and some of the updates. So if you didn't go to the member summit, which most of the folks from Europe didn't go to the member summit in Orlando a few weeks ago, then you can attend this 2-day session in Copenhagen, June 6 and 7. And then in just outside of London, doing a 1-day intelligence forming workshop. And there's each of these have links to the registration. And then we'll be doing a team meeting in Hopkinton. I think that's hosted by EMC on intelligence forming in the Boston area. That'll be in late or mid-June. Should I keep going?
Yeah, and well, I just wanted to add, as part of that meeting, we've been talking about this new role of the knowledge worker, and if you are familiar with the intelligent swarming model, and you're no longer in these tiers of support, and you're also engaging people, the right people within the organization by doing intelligent matching. You might be matching with people across many different groups within the organization. So this is this discussion about how does leadership manage this whole swarm of people who might not necessarily report to one group. So we're talking about, well, so if we do this intelligent swarming model and we're really working as a network instead of a hierarchy, how do we manage that? So that will also be part of that, taking that whole thing around intelligent swarming to another level.
And then we plan to do an online session, a conference call, June 22nd on taxonomies, and we've heard, actually I think we've heard from a couple organizations now that some of the data analytics, data mining tools, and artificial intelligence, cognitive computing kinds of capabilities actually relieve you of having to do a taxonomy, which is actually a very exciting proposition. So we're calling that one to taxonomy or not to taxonomy. And then in December we'll do, well, there's a scheduled team meeting in August, also hosted by PTC on the predictive customer engagement model. That'll be 2.5 days. As we get the location and logistics firmed up, we'll post that on the events page. And then in December, we get our benefactor and sponsor level members together and talk about plans for 2017. That will be in Park City, Utah. And we have dates for our next year's member summit, which will be in April in Monterey, California, right downtown Monterey. And we'll be getting out, over the next couple of months, more information about what that agenda will look like. But you can mark your calendars now for that April event in Monterey, California. Thank you all for your continued interest and support, and hopefully we'll see you at one of the upcoming consortium events. So thanks for joining.